Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Provider Spotlight. My name is Lucas Morissette, and I am a client success consultant at Unyte, which means I have the privilege of serving our wonderful community of providers. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar will be recorded. You will be sent the recording to your email after the session, so if you have to duck out at any point, don't be worried about missing any content. There is a chat, which many of you have already gotten familiar with. You're welcome to interact with the chat. Should you be interested in learning more about the SSP, Sarah, who is one of our wonderful program consultants, will be in the chat and is happy to provide more information. And we will also be having a Q&A in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. We want that time to be as useful as possible for you, so please include your questions in the chat. Sarah will be taking note of them and will aim to answer them in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. It is my pleasure to host what is sure to be a fascinating conversation with Carol Ann Brayley. Carol Ann is a neurodivergent clinical social worker and somatic experiencing practitioner. She has over 29 years of clinical experience and has been delivering the SSP since 2019. Over the past 5 years, she has delivered the SSP to hundreds of clients internationally. On top of serving her clients, Carol Ann is passionate about supporting other SSP providers in creating easier, more enjoyable, and more successful SSP practices. Thank you for being here, Carol Ann.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. Okay, so before we jump into the conversation, I would like to provide a brief description of what the SSP is. So folks who are unfamiliar with it will have some context once we get into some of the applications and wonderful case stories that we'll be exploring. So the Safe and Sound Protocol is music that has been specially designed to enhance the features of sound that tell the body you're safe. Along with sending cues of safety to the nervous system, the SSP trains the auditory system, the ear, to focus on these safety cues. The core SSP protocol is 5 hours, broken down into listening sessions, ranging from as long as 30 minutes to as short as a minute or less, depending on the sensitivity of the listener. Now, Carol Ann, please, will you tell us a bit about your background, how and why you got started with the SSP?
Sure. So right from the very start of my career, I tended to work with more complex people. One of my first positions was in a hospital-based sexual assault and domestic violence care center in Hamilton, Ontario. And I somehow tended to see the people with the most severe and complex trauma. I also have an extremely severe history of childhood trauma myself. And so I know what it is to really suffer. And I just always, between trying to help myself with the after effects of my own trauma history and wanting people to be able to move through whatever they were dealing with in a faster, gentler way, I've always looked for, kind of the cutting edge stuff. And when I first came to SSP, I kept hearing about it from clients who are renting neurofeedback systems. That's one of the things that I offer. And when I looked into it, I didn't even know if I would add it to my practice. I thought, you know what, I want to try it myself. I'll do the training. Maybe I'll just sign up for 6 months and use it for myself and my family. And if I like it, I'll add it to my practice. But the rest is history. Right away, I loved it. And almost all my clients wanted to try it right away. And it just, it moved really fast for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's always so wonderful to hear when providers have their own transformative experiences with the SSP. And as you personally
Exactly.
experienced, that confidence is contagious, right? With your clients, with other providers.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important parts is just being really enthusiastic. I mean, even in the first 3 months, I knew of 16 of my colleagues who signed up to become providers because I can't stop talking about it. No in
Yeah.
between. Either I'm really
And
into.
that was 5 years ago, right? So, if that was
Oh
just
yeah.
the first month, I know you've had such an impact on the provider community. But before we get there, let's start with talking a bit about anxiety.
Yeah.
Anxiety is the kind of core core symptom that we're looking at in this talk, and we're exploring what anxiety is, how it presents, why we have anxiety, and then looking at the SSP's application. So let's start at a high level. What is anxiety? But almost more importantly, why do we have it? What is the purpose of anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the sensation of anxiety feels like, and it's really it's a very important function of our nervous system. It's basically designed to keep us alive. So we have systems in the body that are their job is to detect threat, and it's part of the fight, flight, freeze mechanism. Part of the problem is that in today's world, we're basically living in a society that's not quite what we were designed for. We're meant to be a quiet hunter-gatherer society, and instead, there's just nonstop deadlines and excessive workloads and smartphones pinging all the time. And there's accumulation of stress, and then when you add in trauma and other things, it can just kind of get stuck. And a healthy, regulated nervous system will move through different states very easily and just have a natural transition. But when our physiology kind of gets stuck in anxiety and the amygdala is scanning for danger all the time, it's like your alarm system's just stuck on the on setting. Or maybe it's not stuck there all the time. For some people, it kind of is, but it's just extra reactive and detecting threat where it doesn't exist.
Mm. I love what you said about the sensory environment because that's so important when we look at how our nervous system is responding to our environment. We are all raised in a very different sensory environment than our evolutionary ancestors lived in, and
Yeah,
that's sending. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we're just bombarded by so much. And then once the nervous system is in that heightened state, how we interpret and receive things around us, it's just so much kind of like louder. Even like bright lights are brighter.
Mhm.
Or, and something that I didn't know until recently, until I was reading the book that Stephen Porges co-authored with his son Seth, is that when we feel unsafe, the shape of the ear canal changes, and
Mhm.
so how we perceive sounds is different. And
Mhm.
that made a lot of sense to me. Is one of the most common things that people seek me out for help with is different levels of sound sensitivity, including misophonia, which is the one of the most severe. Um, so yeah, there's just this whole ripple effect that
Mhm.
happens through our whole body.
Mhm. And that's so important, right? Because anxiety is often looked at as a mental health problem. And it's not often talked about that the physical state of anxiety is accompanied by physical changes, one of them being the change in hearing. Can we talk a bit more about what's going on in the body when we're anxious? When a client walks into your office whose primary uh, issue is anxiety, what else is going on in their body?
Usually we see a whole host of other things, and the client usually has no idea that they're connected. Unfortunately, their medical doctor often doesn't either. But what we see is things like increased chronic pain. The body's in this tight state, right? We see digestive issues because if the amygdala believes there's a predator close by, digestion's not high on the list of priorities. If anything, the body may be trying to make itself lighter, so people may have loss of appetite. They could have like IBS, Crohn's disease. Like there's different things like that that might start showing up. And often, someone whose nervous system has been stuck in a dysregulated state for quite a while, maybe they have a severe trauma history, maybe there's other things going on that is just kind of a cumulative load, then we start to see very complex conditions and complex presentations. So I specialize in seeing the most complex people. So when people contact me, I'm usually looking at a list like this long of a whole bunch of complex conditions altogether, but they become very difficult to diagnose. Um, in somatic experiencing, we refer to it as a syndromal pattern of healing, where it often takes a lot of work to produce a change, and the treatments that work for other people don't tend to do as much for them. One of the things I love about SSP and why I got so enthusiastic is that seems to be the exception.
Mhm.
And what I find actually is the people with really severe complex issues often have the most improvements of all. So it's just really lovely. But yeah, we see through the whole body, I think every organ of the body can be affected when there's a lot of anxiety for a long time.
Mhm. Really well put. And just wanna look in a bit on one of the things you said when you're talking about how certain body systems are suppressed, and suppression seems like a bad thing maybe when you think about the word and the valence of the word, but in this case it's decidedly a good thing because the nervous system is prioritizing our survival. It's prioritizing keeping us safe, and that's the job of the nervous system, right? And when, as you said, when a client walks into your office who has, chronic anxiety, and their nervous system is in this threat detection state, this activated state, you see all of these other symptoms which relate to this suppression, which the body is doing on purpose, right? Because that's the function of the nervous system. You
Yeah.
talked a bit about at the end of that discussion on about the SSP and how the SSP is in some ways one of the exceptions for interventions that can really help people who have a complex, sometimes laundry list of set of conditions that you're looking to help them with. Can you talk a bit about how the SSP works to impact anxiety?
Yeah, like there's a whole ripple effect. The SSP, as we know, it's not a treatment for any one specific disorder. It's more of something that brings greater regulation into the nervous system. We use SSP to send cues of safety to the nervous system. We really can't heal from anything, whether physical, emotional, without feeling safe. Because again, if our physiology thinks we're in imminent danger, it's not going to focus on healing. It's going to focus on fighting or flighting or freezing, right?
Mhm.
So what often we see, what one of the things SSP does best is subtle anxiety. It can be a delicate dance sometimes. Sometimes with more complex people, they start out having to go slowly. But there's a real synergistic effect because it starts to bring a sense of safety into the nervous system. It stimulates our social engagement systems. So we start wanting to reach out a little bit more. We often get better at reading facial cues. Often people who weren't comfortable making eye contact before might, without even noticing anything has changed, start making eye contact more than they used to. And so there's a real kind of a positive snowball effect where, you know, it all kind of goes together because if you've been kind of isolated, and when we feel unsafe, and anxiety is literally feeling unsafe, so it's perpetually unsafe, we kind of close in. And as that opens up and we start to connect more and our social skills improve just naturally because we have neurological social engagement systems, we start looking at people, we see their smiles, we have a positive feedback loop, and then we feel even safer and the body regulates more. My ex-husband, when he's not terribly self-aware, and a lot of people, when their improvements show up, they don't notice them because they're so effortless. So for him, on one of his rounds of SSP, we did it in, I think, in December. And as a Canadian, you'll know, Lucas, January is not a happy time of year in
Mhm.
Canada. Light levels are low, and it's the post-Christmas, you know, crash, potential bills and whatever. But he'd come home from being out somewhere and he's like, people are so friendly now. It must be the new year. And I'm like, what do you mean? And he says, people are just smiling and happy now. And I'm like, the rest of the world didn't change. it told me he was making eye contact more. He looked friendlier, and so people were responding in kind. Um, so it's just lovely. It's just
Mhm.
really nice. And then of course, as our physiology settles and we start to feel better, we feel more like going out maybe and doing things, or feeling okay about not doing things. SSP just kind of makes us more of who we are.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's this whole ripple effect where a whole bunch of different areas improve at a time.
I love that anecdote about your ex-husband, and it's so it speaks to one part of the application of SSP, which is specifically for social anxiety. And you talked about the social engagement system, which is this term coined by Dr. Porges, referring to the connection between our internal organs, our heart, our lungs, and our the parts of our body responsible for social engagement, social connection, such as our ears and our eyes and our facial muscles and our voice. And these are connected by the vagus nerve. And the SSP can be thought of as an intervention to stimulate the social engagement system and improve social engagement. Can you talk a bit more about the experience of social anxiety and the application of the SSP? I think even the most regulated people, when they have to speak in front of hundreds of people like we're doing right now, experience a bit of nervousness, a bit of anxiety speaking in front of hundreds of people, which is very evolutionarily very unnatural for our nervous systems.
Absolutely. And so when someone has social anxiety, which actually was one of the things that improved for me very vividly on my very first round. That's part of why I was so excited about SSP. My therapist at the time used to say, "I love SSP, Carol Ann," because I was so different. But yeah, so with social anxiety, we find ourselves overthinking things a lot and second guessing. And either we have a ton of anticipatory stress before an event and we kind of play over in our minds different scenarios and we might worry, and or afterwards we go over, oh my god, why did I say this and what did they think? And we might not want to go to events. And there's different levels of social anxiety. Most, like you say, most of us experience it. For myself, uh, I had social anxiety. It wasn't paralyzing. It wouldn't stop me from going places and doing things, but it might stop me from talking to people, um, or making eye contact sometimes. I didn't really know how to, I don't know, form like you go to a training and then there's a break and everyone form in these little groups. And I'm like, how does that even happen? But then the group started forming around me and I wasn't aware of doing anything differently. But one of the funny stories I have from my very first round of SSP is before I did it, the idea came up to go to England to see my ex-husband's family. And we hadn't been together for very long at the time, and he had never been back there since he was 7 years old. He'd immigrated to Canada. And I hadn't done SSP yet when the idea for the trip came up. And so when it came up, we were going to be staying with his cousin. And I'm like, oh, it's a house with strangers in a strange place. And I feel terrible about it now because they're such lovely people. But I was like, well, if I'm really not comfortable, I might go to an Airbnb because it just seems so stressful. But what's funny is it wasn't until we were on the way home on the plane and we're literally halfway home and I suddenly go, and my eyes fly open. He's like, what? And I'm like, I forgot to get stressed. And it was just funny because I must have met about 45 people there. And I never once second guessed a single thing I said or did. I was very open, I was friendly, I had a great time. And there were actually two of his family members who didn't really talk to us much at all. And I know for certain before SSP, I would have kind of obsessed over it and assumed they didn't like me and tried to figure out why. But, kind of funny. But the only thought I had had at the time is like, wow, their social engagement systems are off. They could really SSP. So, yeah. It was just, and to this day, they kind of seem like they are very warm and loving people, but they almost feel like mystical, magical beings because it was my first experience of it. Uh, yeah, so funny.
Oh, that's such an amazing anecdote and a perfect example of uh, how kind of the SSP works, right? Where it's a bottom up, it's a subcortical intervention. So these
Mhm.
changes are taking place under the hood,
Yeah,
and often the changes manifest in our behaviors. In this case, in your social engagement system, and often the insights are in hindsight. In
yeah,
this case, when you're on the airplane, you're, oh, I completely forgot to be stressed and anxious.
yeah. Like uh, we don't have to learn new skills necessarily. I mean, that can help too.
Mhm.
Those things can go together very well. But the reality is, when our physiology shifts, we're not generally trying to do things differently. We're just doing them differently without noticing.
Mhm.
Uh, it's just it's kind of effortless to an extent when you're going from a bottom up approach, and it's kind of hard sometimes because sometimes there's communities like especially within the autism community where people think we're trying to cure autism or we're not. It's no one's being pressured to change. We're just bringing safety into the nervous system, and when people feel safer, some of those things will become easier, but
Mhm.
they'll still have autism, right? But
Mhm.
just feel happier and safer. That's
Yeah,
yeah.
it's much easier to engage with the world when when we feel safe, when we feel
Yeah.
connected, when we feel secure.
Yeah, and also to feel okay about not engaging when we don't want to,
Mhm.
not second guessing that either, just feeling more comfortable being all of who we are.
Mhm. That's lovely, Carol Ann. And uh, as we look into applying SSP to anxiety, I want to bridge a bit into some of the more practical aspects of it. So when you have an anxious client who comes into your office and is interested in going through the SSP, how do you approach SSP delivery with those clients?
Yeah, now some it depends on how the anxiety shows up for them and what is helpful for them. And so I may ask about that. Some people with anxiety want really a lot of detail. I'm kind of their provider then because I'm very detail oriented. But sometimes people can't handle a lot of detail. So I might ask them, what works best for you? Often I can tell. And sometimes people really need to know what to expect. So for those people, I may send them a written the written playlist for the ones that have vocals so that they can see what would be coming up.
Mhm.
I make sure they have lots of choice. I basically, I emphasize a lot that they're in the driver's seat, that with SSP, it's not about pushing through anything difficult. It's actually quite the opposite. We don't want them to override. Sometimes people have been through things like exposure therapy or, ABA or things that they found difficult. And it's like, no, 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 no. We're just going to listen to music in ideally a setting where we feel safe or as safe as possible, that as safe as that nervous system will allow, and where we feel supported and have someone to co-regulate.
Mhm. In that delivery environment, when you're going through SSP delivery and they have a nervous system response or they want to take a pause, what kind of tools do you teach your clients to support delivery and help them to regulate their nervous systems?
So I'm a somatic experiencing therapist, which is kind of an ideal for SSP providers, although, people can also learn that. And it's one of the things that I cover in my advanced training for SSP providers. But I use somatic experiencing orienting skills a lot with people, where I basically teach them the low tech way of sending piece of safety to the nervous system. They're very simple and easy to use. And I'll recommend something like the iChill app to help them to practice on their own as well. And I do lots of giving control and start with one of the most important things I feel is to teach people how to tell what their body wants. We are socialized to push ourselves through things, no pain, no gain. We also learn that during times of trauma. We don't have a choice about, what, take a break. We don't get those choices. And even just how we're socialized too. No, you don't need a break. You're not tired. You can keep going. You do so love your brother. Just, suck it up, put on a happy face, and act like you're okay. And so it's really important to bring people back to the body and to teach them how to recognize, because ideally with SSP, what we want is to titrate the pacing of delivery to that specific nervous system. In my opinion, that is one of the absolute most important thing. And we can't get there by thinking our way through it. We need to kind
Mhm.
of watch, observe, and see what happens and keep adjusting things. So by teaching people, there's lots of different wonderful ways of offering SSP. For me, most people I observe the start of listening if they're over the age of 13. And then after that, we stay in touch via email. And ideally, they have a friend or family member present to co-regulate. But I want them to know how to tell what their body wants, even when I'm not sitting there in front of them. So I'll teach them to know how to do that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's such an important skill for SSP delivery for both the provider and the client to be able to notice what's going on inside. And obviously different clients will have different capacity and natural
Yeah,
affinity for that.
and and some people won't notice anything during listening, and that's okay too. Then we observe, well, in both cases, it's just as important to watch what happens in between listening sessions as what happens during them. So I will send people a list of the very long list of areas that may potentially improve with SSP. And the nice thing is that the same areas that may improve are also the areas where dysregulation may show up. So I tell people that these will be the areas we will watch, and we're basically going to play detective together, figuring out how your nervous system's responding to the music. And by the data you send back to me, that helps me to advise you when to slow down, when to maybe take time off, when you can maybe pick up the pace a little bit,
Mhm.
and helps me to know what is needed to get things settled right away if dysregulation does occur.
Mm. I love that. I love the way you outline that process of finding the kind of sweet spot for each client for SSP delivery. Can you give the audience an example of, you have an anxious client, you do an SSP listening session. What sort of things may they notice during session, after the session,
Yeah.
between sessions that can help inform the way you titrate the program?
Yeah. So because in my practice, I work with the most sensitive, complex people most often, they virtually always will notice something immediately when they're listening.
Mhm.
Um, and it might be things like feeling like, oh, they can just feel their body relaxing.
Mhm.
Sometimes people, it's just interesting. It's really kind of fun observing. Sometimes people might start laughing and they don't know why. They might get a little bit teary and they don't know why. They sometimes they do know why. One guy during his listening session kept laughing, and while he was listening, he'd look up at me and he would laugh, and I'm like, all right. And so when we paused, I said, I'm curious what was happening. And he was on the spectrum, and he had lots of trauma, and he said, "It's just so weird. I just feel so drawn towards wanting to make eye contact with you, and I can't believe it." So he kept laughing because he's like, "This is fine for me." And for some people, it's as fast as that. They might even say, "Oh, their pain is a lot less."
Mhm.
Or they might feel areas of the body tightening or tensing. And so I just kind of I'll do a little bit, and especially if someone is very apprehensive. Unfortunately, when SSP goes too fast or something like the volume is too loud, it can get very uncomfortable, and some things may get worse at first before they get better. And so sometimes people have had difficult experiences before. Sometimes they have read about difficult experiences before. So depending on either what is in their clinical history, that may indicate to me the level of complexity, or the level of apprehension they have. I might start with a very tiny amount and have them and then pause and say, what did you notice? And as if everything is feeling okay, well, I will say, if you think about the idea of to listening to more, what does your body say? Does it say yes or no? And people can usually tell. And so as long as the body keeps saying yes, and that is lining up with what I feel, we'll just keep doing a little bit more until their body goes, no, that's enough.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, but it's really amazing. Like I've seen everything from like a child who hadn't been spoken words before, saying their first words within minutes after listening the first time. And sometimes, of course, it's several weeks later.
Yeah.
Everyone's different. But yeah, it's really fun.
Mm. I love the attitude you bring to SSP delivery, this optimism and curiosity. Can you tell me a bit more about when someone finishes a session and they their nervous system is giving them signals of being shifting into threat detection mode, into fight or flight. How do you explore that with them and move forward in
Yeah.
delivery?
So an interesting thing, and this is where most of the time, it's not always true. I'll go in with theories, but then I observe that specific individual's physiology. So, but a lot of the time, people with really a lot of trauma or really stuck chronic anxiety, they will need to go pretty slowly at the start.
Hmm.
And it's a delicate dance. So the nervous system may have a moment where it's like, oh, that feels so good. And it's basically this big expansion of the nervous system. But our nervous system feels comfortable with what feels familiar. So if they go to a deeper state of relaxation than what is familiar to them, or it happens much faster than it normally would, the nervous system can launch a counter constriction, and that could show up a split second later. It could show up minutes or hours, or occasionally a couple days later. So sometimes I will usually know if we went too much, and it's not usually going to be very much too much with me because I'm, yeah, baby step it. But usually I will be able to tell that it was just a hair too much. Maybe the last few seconds I could see something happening or they reported it. I will then do some somatic experiencing skills, work with them to get that to settle. But sometime, and then I will say, please stay in touch. I want you to observe how you feel the rest of today, how you sleep tonight, and how you're feeling tomorrow. If nothing feels worse or harder than usual, we know we didn't do too much. If anything is feeling more challenging, we know it was a little too much. And I
Hmm.
ask them to check in, let me know, and then I will give advice for how to proceed. So they might afterwards have a big spike of anxiety or a little spike of anxiety. They might have trouble sleeping. It's usually going to be something they're already dealing with, is a little bit more so than usual. It's most of the time it's not dramatic. Occasionally it is. Um, but I have a lot of different tips and tricks of how to get that to settle quickly. And often what I find is that it ends up being a real positive thing.
Hmm.
Um, and so part of what I do, because nervous systems are contagious, but it is also coming from a very genuine state. So when people have dysregulation show up, they often get worried. Now, I tell people before, I will do my best, and this is my specialization is smooth, gentle processes, but I can't promise there will never be a difficult moment or a difficult day. Realistically, you're having those already, or you wouldn't be here. So when the dysregulation shows up, I actually get really excited with them about it. Because they'll say, oh, that's incredible. Like, yeah, now definitely we want to slow that down. That was a little bit too much, but we can work with this. And I never worry about if the people who get dysregulated are going to have improvements or not. They do. It's very clear their nervous system is responding. And people just have such a hard time processing because it feels like magic if you don't understand. And honestly, even if you do understand, it feels like magic. But so it's just like I might say, I bet that doesn't usually happen when you just listen to music, does it? And they're like, no. And there'll be things like, this is wild. Like, I know we're clearly on the right track here.
Hmm. That That is such a wonderful way to approach nervous system shifts with curiosity. And it kind of takes the worry away from, oh my gosh, this is,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
bad.
Because
Whereas you reframe it as, no, that's it's
and
working. We just
it's
need to fine
yeah,
tune it.
it's entirely genuine. I mean, my preference is they just see improvements right away and nothing but improvements. Um, that's less typical, even when those improvements do happen, especially when they are, the most hoped for ones and ones where there's an enormous amount of stress around and trauma, even like the misophonia community, there's so
Mm,
much suffering. So I make sure that when they're all like, oh my God, it's better already, there's something improving already, I'll say, that's amazing. And yes, but also it's never linear with SSP. It's going to toggle, it's going to go up, down, up, down. So I want you to try to remember and to do your best to stay grounded and reach out to me, that if tomorrow it's suddenly worse than it was before, that's okay. The nervous system is pendulating. It's trying to figure out what to do with this new information it's receiving. And
mm,
if anything, it's the back forth that I get really excited about.
mm.
And it's important that providers know that, because providers get scared too,
Yeah.
especially when they're newer providers. They're like, oh no, it's their biggest fear, something gets worse. But
Hmm.
it's okay. It's okay. It's temporary.
Yeah. Oh, so well put. We're at 40 minutes past the hour. I want to make sure we leave time
Yeah.
for some case stories and obviously the Q&A. So let's dive into some of your success stories. You have many, so let's pick one or
Yeah.
two really
Okay.
really wonderful stories.
So one was actually the partner of a friend of mine. He had a very severe, complex history of childhood trauma. He had never had any kind of therapy for it. He was not willing to go for therapy. He couldn't afford therapy. A lot of people with severe trauma are just terrified. They don't want to open that box, right? But he also had a massive fear of driving. So he was in his 40s. He had never gotten his license. His partner had to drive him everywhere and do all the driving for the whole family. And it was a source of stress for them. So he asked me, would you be willing to do SSP with me? And could this resolve my fear of driving? And I thought, I, I assumed, I said, okay, it will help with your anxiety for sure, and well, almost for sure. And we'll see what happens with the driving. What I'd said was I suspect that it might not be enough to target something that very specific. We should see improvement, but there might be residual. If that happens, I would recommend you look into something like brain spotting to target it directly. To my surprise, it really did. And he had lots of traumas associated with cars and driving. I don't know what they were because we wouldn't talk about any of that. But yeah, within a week or two of starting the process, it did take him a long time to go through. We had to pace it gradually. But within a couple of weeks of starting, he went and got his learner's permit. By the end, he had his license. And it wasn't hard. He said, I mean, at the beginning, he'd feel a little bit of apprehension. I'd say, if when you feel the apprehension, I want you to stop, have your wife take over. I don't want you to push through. We don't heal trauma physiology by overriding and forcing ourselves through something difficult. So yeah, it was amazing. And something that people are often very interested to hear about is that I do SSP with my dogs. I also, when I or one of my associate providers do a SSP with someone, we will do a pet for at no extra charge. And so with my dogs, one of the reasons also that my clients wanted to try SSP is because I worked from home even before the pandemic. I had a 15-year-old dog that had extremely severe arthritis. She, for like the last 8 years of her life, anxious, aggressive barking. She'd go ballistic when people came to the house. Leash aggression, lots of issues. But she was my little SSP wonder dog. And by the second hour of listening on her first round, she started jumping off the couch, which she hadn't done in over 4 years because of pain. She started being able to follow me everywhere. She stopped anxious, aggressive barking. So people would come to the house who were used to her going, right? And instead, like someone who I hadn't seen for over a year came back, and her first appointment, she wasn't even out of my entranceway. And she's like, "What's with Maggie? She's like a different dog." So let me tell you about SSP. And the vet, when we'd go to appointments, he would yell out to the whole waiting room, "It's my 15-year-old miracle dog," because he'd never seen anything like it. She also was being bullied relentlessly by the cat before we started SSP, and improved assertiveness and self-protectiveness is one of the common improvements that we see in humans. Immediately when she did SSP, the cat stopped bullying her. Instead of backing up when the cat did stuff to her, she would just take one step forward and make the cat back up. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't go take an assertiveness skills training course or cross species communication course. When her physiology changed, she just conducted herself completely differently because she felt safe in the world.
Ah, those case stories are amazing. And what I love about the first one, but it's also applicable to the second one, is you don't have to talk about your trauma, talk about
No.
specific
Yeah.
things, or talk about anything really. You don't have to talk in order to
Yeah.
have these profound changes
Yeah.
with
You
the
don't have
SSP.
to. You don't have to, and you can.
Yeah.
Choice matters. That's part of how you heal trauma. It's by having choice, because it's the opposite of, trauma is when we don't have choice a lot of the time.
Mm.
But yeah, and then as a provider, it just changed my whole practice, because it's a little bit soul destroying when you work with people with really severe issues. If they're not improving, you don't want them to be suffering. And so instead of it all being focused upon the problem, it's just like, you get to see the look of amazement. Like, this is great. And you just automatically see stuff shift. And the fun part is the client might not notice at first. And so when people say to me, "I don't think I'm having improvements," I'll say, "Ask those around you." And I send them a list of improvements again. And then usually I hear back, a list of things that are changing. But it's just a whole shift. And it's just added so much joy to my work. Um, yeah, but it just feels like such a gift.
We do have 15 minutes left, Carol Ann. I have one more question that I'd like to ask before we move to the Q&A, and that is, and you kind of go in there talking about your practice and how your practice has
Yeah,
changed. Can you talk a bit more about how your practice in the last 5 years has changed since integrating the SSP?
it's completely changed. Yeah, and it really did pretty early on, because I've never had to do any kind of paid advertising for SSP. Most of my marketing for the until maybe a year ago was entirely an accident. It's just my unbridled enthusiasm, right? Like, my very first SSP client was referred to me specifically for SSP because one of the clients I talked to about it was a therapist. But yeah, it really opened up all kinds of things. Like, I don't see kids for therapy, but I do lots of SSP with kids. So it's basically opened up a different section to my practice, and they mutually support each other. And it's been great in terms of a whole different stream of income, but also I got so busy with SSP that in the last year and a half or so, I started referring out a lot of my therapy clients, partly so that I can focus on things like, advanced training and things. I love working with the providers in different capacities. But it's allowed me to shift some things. I have a much less scheduled life, which is lovely. Sometimes it sounds silly, and but monitoring SSP remotely, like the summer of 2023, I was sometimes responding to SSP check-in emails while tubing down a river. Like, it just allows for this flexibility that I can answer those emails at times that work best for me. And also, I've gotten to meet so many people and to just have this experience of it feels like watching miracles regularly. And at the start, when people would begin, I would say, it just feels like, Christmas. Like I know there's going to be gifts arriving. I don't know what will be in them. I don't know what's going to show up. And very often, like for the longest time, I've kind of gotten used to it, but it still happens sometimes. I would actually start to cry. Happiness for people, because especially when there's been so much suffering in the person, like people will come and say, I've tried everything. Um, and they're scared to have hope. But then when it shifts, it's just so rewarding. And so it's just, yeah, it just gives me so much joy.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I think that's a great way to end our formal conversation. Thank you so much, Carol Ann. This has been a fascinating conversation. We are nearing the
Yeah,
end of our time together, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to answer some of the audience questions.
sure.
Before, did you
One
want to
thing
add
I'll,
something?
one thing I'll just say, if people want to learn more, my website is SSP Yoda, and that's where they can find me.
Thank you very much. I was going to end with that question. So
Great.
thank you for beating me to it. Before we make that transition, I would like to share a bit of information about the current offer we have for those interested in potentially becoming an SSP provider. So if today's session piqued your interest and inspired you to think about how the SSP can support your clients and your practice, we're excited to share that we currently have a limited time offer, which is called the Road to Regulation Bundle, featuring Dr. Peter Levine and Kim Barthel. This offer includes an annual SSP subscription, $100 off training, and the following additions to support you in successful SSP delivery: a free copy of Dr. Peter Levine's new book, An Autobiography of Trauma, A Healing Journey; the exclusive on-demand course from Kim Barthel, Neurobiology of Regulation in Practice. This course also includes continuing education units, and an exclusive live coaching session with Peter Levine and Kim Barthel, How to Track the Nervous System and Why It Matters During SSP Delivery. You'll find a link to the Road to Regulation bundle in the chat, where you can learn more about this offer and get started right away. Or if you have additional questions, you'll also find a link in the chat where you can schedule a complimentary call directly with our team at a time that's convenient for you. All of this information, including a recording of this session, will be sent to your email. With that, let's move on to answering your questions. So with that, the first question from Lindsay: how would this, assuming she's referring to SSP delivery, be managed with interoception difficulties? So think for those clients who aren't able to track what's going on inside. How do you manage that?
Yeah, that comes up a fair amount. And so sometimes it's just a matter of looking at what is practically different, in their day-to-day life, or what the people around them notice. It's actually quite common. Lots of people with trauma, we don't want to feel what's in the body. That way, that feels unsafe. Or different forms of neurodivergence that can be common. But yeah, we look for clues in day-to-day life. Um, Ultimately, I don't need a lot of detail. Better or worse is enough.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes if we might not be sure if either of those are from SSP initially, but it usually becomes clear. So yeah, there's always data somewhere. And if there isn't, at the very least, what it means is nothing's getting worse. Um, when we don't see anything at all the whole time, those are the people I worry whether or not they will have improvements. Most of the time, they still do. Sometimes they will show up like kind of a week or two after we finish. There might be a mild period of dysregulation, and then usually the following week is when we start to see improvements.
Mm. For those who have difficulties with interoception, do you change the way that you have them listen to the SSP independently, or the way they give feedback when you do your asynchronous check-ins?
Yeah, I really try to do what sits the best with them and let them take the lead on that if I can. Even like some of my clients will not be fantastic about checking in, and I will try to pursue them a little bit, but you do your best. But also, you kind of get to know them, and we can see as providers on the dashboard what pacing someone's using. So I can usually tell from what I'm seeing there whether or not I need to be concerned. Um, but yeah, it's a little bit more of a puzzle, but part again, that's part of where a lot of people who don't have the skill yet of interoception, for some people it takes a lot longer than others, but using those somatic experiencing skills and kind of teaching how to check, a lot of times they can start even with a little bit. It's kind of, they're building new muscles, and the more they do it, the more they can connect. But also they, as they go through SSP, they may start to become more sensitive to those sensations.
Mm. And which we kind of covered before is you have this list of symptoms that or changes that someone might notice, and a lot of the things on those lists are physical, such as sleep.
Yeah, exactly. What's your sleep like? What's your
Yeah.
digestion like? We don't need deep introspective anything really. We don't need lots of detail. Um, I think it's great, and that a lot of providers will, they teach all about polyvagal and all of that, and I feel like it's my dirty little secret kind of, but I actually don't do much of that.
Mm,
I will educate people generally about it, but I try and keep it really simple. Are things feeling better or worse?
mhm. Well put. One question from Tammy Hull. Tammy asked about whether SSP would help misophonia, and you did mention using the SSP with misophonia. Can you tell a bit more about how the SSP can help misophonia, and maybe some examples you've seen?
Yeah. As we know, one of the things SSP does best is send cues of safety to the nervous system. It starts to settle that, alarm system that's been kind of stuck in the on or extra reactive state. And it actually, my very first SSP client, now she didn't come to me specifically for misophonia. She had anxiety and depression and was on a medical leave, but she had misophonia as well. And initially, we didn't know if her misophonia responded until she went out to brunch because she was on a medical leave. So, and she lived alone, so she had control of her environment. But then when she went out to brunch and there was a 3-year-old screaming, she said before SSP, she would have had to leave, and it would have ruined her whole day. But as it was, not only was she able to stay, but she enjoyed it.
Mm,
And she was able to not focus on it. I see lots and lots and lots of people with misophonia. It's probably the biggest demographic I've seen in the last couple of years, but it's always been a big part of my practice.
mm,
It very often does respond. For the longest time, it completely resolved for virtually everyone that I saw. My ex-husband actually, he showed no improvements at all in his first round. It can take more than one round, but his second round, his misophonia resolved completely by the second hour of listening. And that was
mm,
August 2019. It's still resolved today. Now that the misophonia community has kind of taken me by storm, the summer of 2023, I was getting a dozen inquiries per day from people with misophonia because a couple of my very lovely clients won't stop talking about me online, no matter right at the time, because it was really, I had taken someone as an exception to my waiting list, and yeah, then it all kind of blew up. Um, but now that I work with some of the most severe people, it can be more challenging, and it can sometimes take more than one round. But very often we do see it respond, and sometimes within the first few days, we will
mm,
see, a little girl who would her one of her biggest triggers was breathing sounds. 4 days in to SSP, she was still on the first hour of listening. When her mom picked her up from school, she got in the car and told this story like it's a fun story, how the teacher had the whole class do breathing exercises together. She thought it was really funny because they got to lie on the floor, and she did not notice herself. She was not triggered by it.
mm.
That's very common, that kind of thing.
Ah, I love that. Um,
You can see how it's fun.
yeah. One more question. I think we have time for one more question. This one's from Linda Tran. Linda's asking, any tips to avoid too much safety in the nervous system? In other words, when safety in the body can be a trigger.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the people that need to go really slowly at first. The first hour of SSP is intended to be, I believe, mostly calming and settling to the nervous system. From my understanding, the first 2 hours are preparing physiology for the filtering in hours 3 to 5. So for many people, they just find it deeply relaxing. When safety feels unsafe, that's the hour we need to go the most slowly on. So I look for the increment that the body will accept without triggering off that counter constriction where it's like, what's that? This isn't safe. And so for some people, that may mean that, the current recommendation is up to 30 minutes per day of listening, as long as that goes well. For some of those people, maybe they can listen to 1 minute or 3 minutes. For some of them, it could be 5 or 10 seconds. And that was something I kind of discovered by accident. That because someone referred to me, there was no room at all to turn up the dial on how severe his issues were. I started him with 6 seconds at a time, not expecting to see change. Dramatic improvement from the first listening
Mhm.
session. Actually, one of his issues was misophonia. And by day two, only 12 seconds into the first hour of listening, his mom was able to speak to him out loud without triggering him for the first time in over 2 years. The same client had school trauma and dyslexia, very severe dyslexia, also pathological demand avoidance. It's a very long list of symptoms of diagnoses.
Mhm.
um, and he's still over a year later not finished the first hour. He listens to a few seconds when he's willing. But by 3 minutes and no, 3 weeks and 4 minutes into the first hour of listening, he, as someone who before it was a battle to get him to sign his name to a greeting card, he started writing not book, just a book, but a trilogy. The last word count was it's over 250,000 words long. He learned AI. He's working on a computer game to go with his books, and he's using AI to create characters for the game. He also has written tons of poetry about his emotional inner world. And he's where I learned that SSP can be microdosed, and it's one of the things I teach providers in my advanced training. So
Mhm.
yeah, you sneak it in, and ideally with co-regulation, if the
Mhm.
person he wouldn't be willing, but if they are willing to use weighted blankets and practice somatic experiencing skills, but we never gave him any information at all. All he's doing is the music, as well
Mhm.
as works with another organization in the UK. But yeah, it can my motto from the start has been I believe that anyone can do SSP and can do it successfully as long as it is specifically titrated to the nervous system.
Mhm. Just got to find the sweet spot, right, Carol Ann?
That's right. And the sweet spot keeps changing
Yeah.
throughout the process, especially as we move from 1 hour of filtered music to the next, because the filtering on each hour is different. So how it lands in the nervous system will be different. Some people, like that particular client, it may change from day to day. So I had no roadmap with him because I don't think SSP had ever been done that way before. And when I tried to consult, people would say, I can't help you, but you just Sharon Cacciato with Unyte said, I'm happy to be a sounding board for you. But I think you're, you just got to do what you think is
Mhm.
right. And so, yeah, by the second week, I said, I don't want to have to be smart. He was the first SSP client. I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. And I said, let's put him in charge. You ask him and which is perfect for someone with pathological demand avoidance, right? Ask him every day how many seconds. And his mom said, well, he's not going to know. He's going to make up random numbers. I'm like, no, he won't. He's going to know. And I knew I was right when she said, he's doing this weird thing. I was like, what is he doing? He'll say, 5 seconds. No, 10. No, 15. I'm like, he's got it. He already knew better how to titrate SSP than many providers do, especially when they start. But without having been taught, he's sensitive enough. That's why I like working with the sensitive people. They feel every nuance. When he thought it, he could feel something in his body and he would change his answer, or he would do the reverse. 30 seconds, no. 20, no. 15.
Mm.
It's perfect.
Oh, I love that story. Carol Ann, we are over time, so let's wrap here. Thank you everyone for joining us today. You are all vital members of this incredible revolution of connection and safety, and we are delighted to be in community with you. Carol Ann, thank you very much. It has
Yes,
been
and
a
thank you
pleasure.
everyone for attending or watching the recording later. Thank you so much.